It's the Bird Emergency and Grant Williams here with you, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Borrelle. Are you a famous Kiwi, Steph?
I don't think so.
Now, Steph's a David H. Smith Research Fellow at the University of Georgia, but before that you were doing piles of work on plastics and seabirds at the University of Auckland. Could you give us some of the highlights of your time at the University of Auckland?
It was the Auckland University of Technology, and I did my PhD research there, and my project was looking at how seabirds recover after predator eradication on our offshore islands. New Zealand's a seabird diversity hotspot. We have about 86 species that breed in New Zealand, only in New Zealand, and about 43% of those are endemic. So hugely important seabird area. And we also have a bit of an issue with invasive predators. We've got some wonderful birds, but they've been heavily impacted by invasive predator species. And so one of the strategies that we use in New Zealand is to take those predators off those islands to allow recovery. And we've been doing that for about, nearly 100 years, I suppose, accidentally or otherwise. And so we've got this amazing opportunity now to actually really delve into how ecosystems and these birds are recovering following those conservation actions.
What were the main locations, the main islands that the research focused on?
I focused on the Hauraki Gulf, so it's quite a large area around the Auckland region, going from the Coromandel Peninsula up to sort of halfway up the sort of spit of northern New Zealand, and there's over 150 islands in that area, so quite a large area to look at. And yeah, I had a really nice data set provided by the Northern New Zealand Seabird Trust, who I'm a trustee for as well, and we looked at different statuses of islands. So we had islands that still had predators on them, islands that have had predators removed, and those that never had predators on them at all. And so we were able to compare differences between those islands. So it was quite a phenomenal data set to be able to use and also to get out to those islands as well.
What were the main differences that you saw between those sort of three cases, the never had predators been removed, and where predators are still occurring?
We found really a limited number of species on islands with predators on them. That was sort of be expected. And then the islands actually that had predators removed had much greater diversity of seabirds than islands that never had predators on them at all. And there's a good reason for that, is because the size of the islands were much smaller on those ones that had never had predators, for obvious reasons. That when you have a large island, you've got more opportunities to modify it, use it for farming or agriculture or other sort of purposes, and more opportunity for predators to be introduced as well.
Do you think in the case where the predators have been eradicated and then you had a greater diversity of seabird species coming back, do you think that is indicative of what was there before, or do you think it's opportunistic new colonisation by certain species?
I think it's a combination of both. When we looked historically at what species had been recorded on some of those islands, and they do change a little bit over time, but once they sort of I guess the density of the birds on the island reach peak, they tend to sort of stay quite stable. The species communities tend to stay quite stable. So I think there will probably be a little bit of variation in the returning species. So seabirds are quite social, and they are attracted to where other birds are as well. And so that's why acoustic attraction can be quite successful with seabirds. And I'm talking about pelagic species, so our Procellariiform family, which are the open ocean dwellers, the albatrosses and petrels and shearwaters. We don't have any albatross in the Hauraki Gulf breeding, at least. So mostly those petrels and shearwaters, and they have interesting life history traits. They're attracted to the same breeding site, so they will tend to go back to the site that they fledged from. But they're also very attracted to other sites where other species or the same species are, and we've had a lot of success with that at Tawharanui, which is one of our mainland sites, and we've had calls of grey-faced petrels and a number of other species, and those populations are actually starting to establish. So Yeah, they're very social in that respect, which is helpful in returning them to the islands.
What's the method you used for bringing them in? Is it playing out the calls just acoustically, or are you also doing something like those? Where was that famous gannet? He died. You remember
Yeah,
him?
yeah. The concrete gannet. Yeah,
yeah. Where the one gannet turned up and fell in love with the concrete statue. That was an effort of putting, I think, about a dozen statues on a cliff, hoping to recolonise it, but only one turned up.
Yeah, what a heartbreaking story. That poor lonely gannet just wanted a mate.
He died of a broken heart.
Yeah. There's an albatross story like that, and down in Southland, actually, the northern Royal Albatross colony, about a bird who returns every year waiting for his mate, and she never shows up, and he's finds it a bit difficult to get a new mate just because he's a bit older and less desirable, I suppose. But so decoys are really useful with surface nesting birds like albatross and gannets. But the birds that I was looking at are mostly burrow nesting birds. So they're a really interesting group of species in that they dig holes in the ground, and that's where they mate and nest. And so they're not necessarily attracted to visual cues, but definitely to acoustic and sound cues. So we use mostly big speakers that are powered by solar panels to play the calls at night time or in the evening when they're coming in to find a nest or to feed their young. And they're also, so they're nocturnal species as well.
I guess many people would be familiar with the behaviour of shearwaters coming back to nesting burrows. That's famous here in Australia with our mutton birds coming back and being a bit of a tourist attraction. What other species are doing that en masse?
A lot of the petrel species. So we have a number of petrels which are quite similar looking to the shearwaters, and they don't necessarily always flock in such big groups, but there are definitely large groups of petrels flying around as well that do the same thing. And also with storm petrels, we've got a great little species called the white-faced storm petrel, and they're quite the sight to see when they come into land, just tens of thousands of them just swarming around like moths in a flame when you have your headlamp out there in the dark on a cliff. So similar types of behaviour in other types of seabirds like the shearwaters in Australia.
In these kind of locations that are fairly remote, at least difficult for humans to traverse, even if they're fairly close to civilization, is light pollution a problem for the birds?
Yes, absolutely. We have quite a few cases of Cook's petrels which breed on Aotearoa, Little Barrier Island, which is quite a large island in the Hauraki Gulf. It's a nature reserve, so it's really high quality, pristine habitat. But the birds fly across Auckland to go to the Tasman Sea to feed. There have been a number of cases of Cook's petrels flying into the Sky Tower or other very lit buildings in the Auckland region. So it does happen frequently in Auckland, and also there's some cases of birds flying onto boats as well. So ships with lights on them, cruise ships having birds end up on them from New Zealand.
Are those kind of collisions usually fatal? Like, I'm thinking more of the birds flying into ships rather than birds flying into buildings. Are they fatal collisions usually?
They don't have to be. I guess it depends on how fast the bird's flying and
and what they whack into, I guess.
What they whack into. But quite often they'll land on the deck and they'll be fine as long as they get a few minutes and a bit of quiet time to just regroup themselves and maybe get thrown off the ship in a kind way, of course. Unfortunately, what we have is a lot of people aren't aware of how to handle these birds when they do land on ships or boats. And so there was a case just recently this year where some shearwaters landed on a cruise ship, and they put them into boxes, and they overheated and died. A number of them died, which was very unfortunate. So while it does happen and it doesn't have to be fatal for these birds, it's about educating those people that are out on the boats and the ships to handle them properly and to understand what's happening.
And the poor old seabirds face triple whammy or even a quadruple whammy, because we've got overfishing, we've got the plastic waste in the oceans, which I really want to explore with you in a moment. We've got the invasive species on their breeding grounds, and then we've got just ever-increasing human encroachment onto habitat. Do you think many of the species that we have present nowadays will survive maybe the next 50 years?
I think it's going to be a mixed bag, and you're right that they face a multitude of different pressures, and both when they're out in the open ocean and when they're on land. We can manage the land-based threats a lot more easily, and predators have been shown to have the biggest impact on seabird populations because they attack all life stages of some species, and particularly that new generation that's come out every year, and seabirds will keep continuously return to an island and keep trying to breed, even though they don't necessarily produce a successful fledgling because of predation. But then, they go out to the ocean and they're faced with plastic and climate change. It's hard to understand how those pressures might affect a seabird population. Each species is affected relatively differently by different threats, and so it starts to become very complex. So it's hard to say across all of those species whether any will go extinct in the next 50 years or so. What I would say is that there are some that are disproportionately affected by those individual threats, so whether that's fisheries or plastic pollution. And climate change is definitely having an impact, I'd say, but probably not to the same level that predation from invasive species has as well. So from what I can tell from my research is that once we take predators off, that actually gives those populations a really good bolster, and so they can increase in numbers. But that doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels, because those threats at sea are increasing and the pressures are increasing. Food foraging opportunities are being reduced, and how those foraging opportunities will be affected by climate changes is sort of unknown as well. So some species will do really well, and some species won't. So ones with smaller populations and that already are quite restricted or have very specific foraging requirements are probably going to be the ones that suffer the most.
Some of the species that are going to do well in this scenario are actually going to become a threat to their less common relatives.
Perhaps a threat may not be the most appropriate way to say it, and unless, there's always competition for breeding sites.
Yeah, in terms of displacement.
Yeah, I think that most seabirds are reasonably social. We have lots of, at least on the islands in the Hauraki Gulf, we have different species that tend to be, they are quite happy cohabitating with other species. There's slight differences in their breeding times, and so they can share nests or swap out nests and things like that. But then again, you do have other species like bullers, shearwaters, the rako, which are particularly aggressive, and they've actually forced out all the other species, most of the other species, off of the Poor Knights Islands and the Hauraki Gulf, and have almost made a mono colony. So, but most, bullers, shearwaters are the only ones that I know of that are particularly aggressive that may force out other species. And I think the trickiest thing would be that the populations would increase to a point where the habitat would start limiting them anyway.
Let's talk about plastics, because you're all over the internet talking about plastic. So I saw one of the photos that you'd put up with cigarette lighters and combs and pegs, all sorts of things that have been found in the digestive tracts of seabirds. So can you give us a bit of a rundown on what the problem is, where is there a part of the world that has a bigger problem than others, and which are the species that are most at risk from our careless disposal of plastic?
Yeah, so again, it's quite species specific on which ones are prone to eating plastic or ingesting plastic. In terms of the spatial distribution, I would say there's definitely an overlay with the species that are foraging in areas where there are high levels of plastic pollution. The North Sea is a really good example of an area that's been well studied, and the levels of plastic pollution in the northern former reflect that spatial variation in plastic. So I think there's an overlap there where there are currents and eddies that aggregate plastic pollution, and there's a higher level of seabirds in those regions. Then you're going to find a little bit more plastic in them than other areas, which sort of makes sense when you think about it, because plastic moves around the same eddies and currents that the primary producers that are feeding the krill and other fish that are feeding the seabirds. And then in terms of which species are more likely to ingest plastics, we've been finding Priscillariiforms, forms, those tube-nosed birds, the albatrosses, shearwaters and petrels have the highest propensity for eating or ingesting plastic. That, again, is potentially because of that spatial overlap where plastic is, and also out at sea, if a piece of plastic is floating in the water or just below the surface of the water, it might look like food to a bird and they may be attracted to it more, or because of the microorganisms that are attracted to it may be giving off dimethyl sulfide, which is a chemical cure that seabirds can smell. So there's some theories about it, but we're still trying to unravel exactly why some seabirds are more likely to eat plastic than others.
Does that indicate that certain plastics are actually have a chemical attractant to the birds, making it a more appetizing mistaken meal?
Well, it's not the plastics themselves; it's the little bits of marine biota that are attracted to anything that's floating in the water. If you've ever been on a boat and you sort of look down below the surface line of the water, there's always some scum and little algae and things like that attract to anything that's in the water, and so those things are potentially responsible for emitting that cue. That scent cue.
Okay.
But again, there's a lot more research that we need to do to be able to fully understand that. That's one of the theories that's been sort of put forth, as well as the different types of feeding mechanisms. So seabirds have quite a variety of foraging methods. They can be surface skimmers or divers or pursuit divers. So depending on the way that they catch their food, because it could also be having an influence on what sort of plastics and how much they're collecting in their guts.
How does the ingestion of plastic affect the mortality rate of particularly the tube-nosed birds?
Well, adult mortality, it's a little bit hard to tell. They do eat hard objects, and so there may be a case of that they are able to have plastic inside their guts and there is no problem there and they're quite okay with it. Some species are able to regurgitate the stomach contents. The biggest problem really is when they're raising chicks and they go out and they feed and they collect a lot of plastic and they take that back to the chick and they feed the chick a pile of plastic, and they end up starving and being stuffed full of plastic because they don't have any ability to get any other type of nutrition. And so they'll either dehydrate because there's no water in the plastic and eventually starve to death. That's the biggest impact, I think, on direct mortality of seabirds. In terms of adults, it's really hard to tell, because if a seabird dies at sea, most of the time their carcass is lost, and it's very, very difficult to tell. And even if they're washed up on the beach, they might be full of plastic, but that might be just one contributing factor of how that bird died. So pointing the finger is tricky, but it doesn't mean that it's not having an impact.
It seems like a problem that we're just unwilling to solve in most Western countries about dealing with plastic. Have you seen any programs that have been locally successful in limiting the amount of plastic that gets into the marine environment?
I'm pretty optimistic that I think we are seeing quite a bit of change, at least in my time over the last several years of being quite active in the plastic world, I suppose. There's a lot of things that are happening around, a lot of social activism and local scale work that's been done to stop communities or reduce some communities' plastic use, and therefore the potential impact that they have on the environment. So I am optimistic, but I do think it's a problem that also needs legislative action. We need to do a top-down approach to actually see the real impact. There are there's plenty of evidence that show when a plastic bag ban, for instance, is put in place, then the numbers of plastic bags that are found in the environment in that particular area are reduced by quite significant amounts, 70 to 80 to 90%. So yeah, there is action that's happening. It just feels like it's a bit slow maybe.
Now, we've just, in the state that I live in Australia, have just brought in a plastic bag ban, a voluntary ban by the two major supermarket chains. How proactive has New Zealand been in taking action on reducing plastic into the marine environment?
So this year our government's announced that there will be a plastic bag ban implemented in the very near future. We banned plastic microbeads in personal care products in July of 2018, so just this year. So we haven't been doing as much as we should be given our reputation as an environmentally friendly nation, in my opinion. And I think it's really important that we start to take bigger steps. And I feel like the climate in the country has changed to a more environmentally minded government. And so I'm more optimistic about how things are going to play out in the next couple of years. But in terms of what we've done so far, I don't think we've done enough. And we need to speed up that kind of action.
What kind of organisations in New Zealand are leading the charge? Like if someone's listening and they're in New Zealand, what's an organisation that they can contact or become involved with to help do practical measures, but also to increase pressure on politicians?
Sustainable Coastlines is a really good organisation here in Aotearoa. They do a lot of beach cleanups, so actually getting out into the environment and picking up plastic off the beach is a crucially important thing. You know, the more we take off the beaches, the less is going to be in the ocean, and we have to stop the flow of that plastic going into the ocean in the first place. But we do need to start thinking about cleaning it up. So Sustainable Coastlines do an amazing job there. I'm involved with a group called the Aotearoa Plastic Pollution Alliance, which is a sort of a ragtag group of academics and NGOs and individuals that really care about plastic pollution. And we're petitioning government and making submissions to get progressive quick action happening on plastic pollution. And I think if you're interested in helping out, then writing submissions to your MPs and writing letters to the Prime Minister is, it's kind of an old school way of creating change, but it's actually a very effective way of communicating what individuals and communities want to see their future become, and getting out into the environment, cleaning up what you see, but also, getting involved in politics is a good way to go.
I read somewhere recently that parliamentarians' office is something like 15 times more affected by receiving a letter or a phone call than any kind of push on social media.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I mean, they're the people that make the decisions, and we're just bombarded with social media campaigns. I can't keep up with all the petitions on single-use plastics that happen in Aotearoa and alone, let alone globally. And I mean, I started my own petition several years ago just for the Auckland region. And then, but that was adding on to probably hundreds of petitions that had already been put out there. And yeah, I mean, Facebook and Twitter is just sort of this barrage of information about either the litany of horrors that we happen to perpetrate on the environment or other things that kind of grab our attention. And so I think there's a little bit of, I think people get a bit conditioned to seeing social media, and so it doesn't have as much of a powerful impact. Although, a cleverly conducted public social media campaign can be very effective. It's just about hitting it at the right time. But yeah, I'm all for going direct to the door of the Prime Minister or to parliamentarians and to get them to do things.
Have you had much face-to-face contact with decision makers in New Zealand? I'm not even going to try and say Aotearoa because I'm going to make it sound really bad.
I've worked alongside a lot of politicians and decision makers. We had a lot of support from the Green Party and Denise Roche, for instance, on plastic in Auckland or plastic bag-free Auckland. There's a lot of people who are in Parliament who have good policies or good ideas around environmental policy. So in terms of me sitting at the table, I tend to try and focus on my research and provide information to others to pass that on. But I'm happy to always put put my voice in there if I can.
Do you think many of them are aware of the importance of New Zealand as a seabird location or a seabird haven? Apart from the Arctic and the Antarctic, it's the key location for seabirds in the world, don't you think?
Yeah, and California as well is one a good spot as well. So, and Pacific has a few good spots, but New Zealand, Aotearoa, is definitely the capital in terms of seabirds. Unfortunately, I don't think many of the public really understand how many species we have and the types of species that we have and how incredibly amazing these birds are, and also how incredibly important they are in terms of their role as ecosystem engineers, and they tell us about the health of the oceans. They've been the reason, they've been telling us about plastic pollution for decades. One of the first reported events of plastic ingestion in seabirds was from Aotearoa. It was from fairy prions in 1958, which is going back a very long time. And so, yeah, and given their history and their importance as ecosystem components or keystone species, you might call them, very few people really know about them. And I think that politicians are a part of the community, and so they don't necessarily have a clear understanding. So, yeah, I think there needs to be a lot more education and outreach about seabirds.
I think they're kind of the invisible species, aren't they? I can remember the first time I saw a fairy prion on Western Port Bay here in Victoria, and I was probably about 6 or 7, and I was a total bird nut as a kid. The series of the Gould League of Bird Lovers books. I even had a 2-volume set of Birds of New Zealand, the Peter Slater Field Guide to Australian Birds. I had an Audubon Society book on waterfowl of the world. I was never interested in fire engines and aeroplanes. It was always birds, 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 birds. When did you become a bird nut? Or are you a bird nut?
A bird nerd. I am a bird nerd. I wouldn't necessarily call myself a twitcher, but and if you know what that is, you probably are a twitcher or very close to it. Right?
Well, I don't have one of those jackets that they all seem to wear.
Just the giant binoculars. I've always been fascinated with New Zealand birds. We have some really unique species, kia and kaka and the kiwi, of course, but I really fell in love with seabirds not until I was in my 20s, and I had an opportunity to go out to some of the islands out here in the Hauraki Gulf. And I saw those white-faced storm petrels that I was talking about, and they were just surrounding me. And I had known a little bit about seabirds, but it wasn't until I actually saw them literally in my face and at my feet that I really saw how phenomenal they are and how important it is that we protect them and how unique they are. So, yeah, I'm a late bloomer to the seabird world.
Your bio's pretty impressive. You've been a leader for quark expeditions. Where are some of the amazing places you've been looking at birds?
I think the most amazing place would have to be South Georgia. That was just incredible. And the Falkland Islands, we had a trip to a black-browed albatross colony. And it was just, it's hard to find the words how spectacular it was.
Steph, this is an audio podcast. Yeah. Find the words, okay? Find the words.
It was just, I saw chicks hatching, and I it was in tears because it was so incredibly beautiful, and just the care of adult birds with their young and their protectiveness and their just sheer beauty. I mean, they're stunning looking animals, but also their size. You don't often get very close to seabirds, and so they often look quite small out at sea, but they can be quite impressively large animals. And so that was an incredible spot. The other place that I really found completely mind-blowing in terms of birds was New Zealand's subantarctic islands. So Campbell Island, where southern royal albatross breed, they are like airplanes flying over your head as they come into land. I mean, they're enormous. They have 3-meter wingspans, but so elegant and so graceful until they hit the ground, and they're quite comical and have these, very interesting, intricate communication and mating behavior that I could just watch forever. My hands were freezing, and I had to walk down the mountain, but I could have stayed there forever, to be quite honest. Stunning. And then sooty shearwaters, just tornadoes of shearwaters around the island.
They're amazing how fast they come into their burrows, shearwaters. They're just amazing birds. But because they're returning to their burrows at nightfall, people just don't see them. They don't notice them, even if they're close by.
Yeah, they're incredibly stealthy birds, and New Zealand storm petrel is a particularly stealthy bird as well. We can't even see it half the time, but also because there's not very many of them. We use, so the sunbirds are really interesting. So with the grey-faced petrels, we can use a strategy called war whooping, and you can stand on the side of a cliff at nightfall when the birds are coming in, and make some war whooping noises that makes them just sort of swirl around you and land at your feet, so you can pick them up and band them and take some measurements and things like that. So, would you like me to give you a demonstration?
I would. I was going to ask you.
Okay, are you ready?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That's kind of like cowboy and Indian noises.
Yeah, it is. And so you do that very loudly. And a friend and colleague of mine, Megan Friesen, did her PhD on seabirds as well, and she found that women's voices are much more attractive to grey-faced petrels coming in with the war whooping sound than lower frequency or lower, lower frequency males' voices. So there you go. Maybe that's why there's quite a few women in seabird research.
Could be. Now you mentioned the New Zealand storm petrel. I can't speak to a New Zealand seabird researcher without asking you to tell the story about the New Zealand storm petrel.
Right. So the New Zealand storm petrel was Frigetta moriana, and it is a bird that was thought to be extinct from the 1800s. So for over a century, no one had made any recorded sightings of it. There was some specimens, very few specimens around the world in museums. And then in 2003, it was rediscovered on a pelagic tour out there in the Hauraki Gulf by some English folk, I think, Sav Seville, who came over from Sicily, the Sicily Islands in the UK, the Isles of Sicily, sorry. And so they found this bird and went out and found a whole lot just foraging out in the Hauraki Gulf.
Is Brent Stevenson credited with the rediscovery as well?
Yes, Brent Stevenson is. He was on the boat where they found it.
He's a Kiwi, isn't he?
He is a Kiwi, yeah.
With a name like Brent, he has to be. He should be in the test team,
Brent.
The cricket team.
Yeah.
Or...
and then Chris Gaskin and Matt Rayner from University of Auckland and now the Auckland Museum. And Chris Gaskin is he runs the Northern New Zealand Seabird Trust. They spent quite a lot of time out in boats in the Hauraki trying to catch birds, and they managed to get quite a few in about 2011, I think it was, and they put some radio receivers on them to try and find out where they were breeding, because up until that point we had no idea where they were breeding. When it was assumed that they were breeding in the Hauraki Gulf because they found brood patches, and it wasn't until 10 years later that the breeding site was discovered on Aotearoa on Little Barrier Island.
Now,
just quite fortuitous.
You mentioned brood patches. They found brood patches. That's brood patches on these birds that they had managed to capture.
Yeah, so brood patches indicate that the bird's breeding or sitting on an egg or a chick, and their belly fur gets a bit worn away. Not fur, sorry, feathers. Birds don't have fur.
We all know what you mean. They caught them at sea and fitted radio transmitters to them and were able to track them back to the island. So what's the status of the New Zealand storm petrel, the rediscovered famous seabird icon? What's the status nowadays?
So it's still critically endangered by, as listed by the IUCN Red List. We've managed to band and recapture about 425 or just under 450 individuals since 2013 when the program kind of started. And so there's some population analysis being done on it now, and it seems like the population's a little bit bigger than we thought in the couple of thousands. There is some suspicion that they're breeding on other islands in the Hauraki Gulf, but we haven't been able to locate where those islands are. So there's a bit more research going on in the next couple of years to try and search out those burrows for the New Zealand storm petrel. They're very cryptic. They come in very quietly into the forest, and Aotearoa is nearly 3,000 hectares, and so it's quite a large island to search for these burrows, and the densities of the colonies aren't particularly high. So it's been a tricky job, but we're learning a lot about them.
I'm assuming that's the New Zealand storm petrel is one of your favourite seabirds, just maybe purely and simply because of the story attached to it. What are some of your other favourites?
I'm a particular fan of the albatross, the royal albatrosses. They're so resilient and elegant, and phenomenally interesting, and every time you learn something about them, they do something else that surprises you. So it's confusing and exciting because you're always learning something new. But yeah, I like all the seabirds actually. every time I hang out with a different one, they become my favorite. Buller shearwaters were my favorite. I spent some time out on the Poor Nights doing some population surveys out there, and they were my favorite for that couple of months after that. But seabirds are just such incredible creatures.
Even skewers?
Yeah, okay, so maybe they're not my favorite, but they're fascinating birds, and they do provide, they do have a role to play in the environment. They may be a little bit gory for some people when they're inside a dead whale, or another ripping a penguin to pieces or something as grotesque and brutal as that. But I do like them. I think they're fascinating animals.
I think the most gruesome wildlife photography I think I've ever seen was a white-phased giant storm petrel that had been inside a whale carcass. It was almost glorious crimson when it came out.
Yeah. It's a phenomenal sight to see two of them ripping a penguin chick apart.
And they don't have the most amazing.
This is the kind of thing you say on your podcast.
They don't have the most amazing heads either, do they? I mean, they're definitely not the glamour bird of the ocean.
No, but I mean, when you look at their bills, it's you get a good photo of a giant petrel, and you can just see the plates of the bill. It's incredibly detailed and complex. So I think they're interesting. They're like looking at a seabird under a microscope in all the grotesque forms.
Are they a complicated social species?
Giant
petrel. Yeah, I'm thinking like the more you watch gulls. So we've got the silver gull here, and I think you have a very similar form in New Zealand. They're incredibly complicated if you watch their groups interact. Petrels and let's say even albatrosses and even storm petrels, do they have complex social interactions?
Yeah, absolutely. Their mating behaviour is incredibly complex, and there's a lot of divorce rates among people to think, or there's often this idea that seabirds are quite monogamous in their pair bonds, but quite often they'll divorce and find themselves or find their way into a new burrow and move around quite a bit. So there's a lot of things that we're learning about them that are potentially maybe turning our previous ideas about behaviour upside down a little bit. So yeah, definitely interesting behavioural patterns in all of these birds.
Yeah, I wondered where you were going with the divorce rate thing and the seabird researchers and whatnot. So yeah. Now,
well, probably spending a bit too much time out on islands and covered in seabird puke is not particularly glamorous. So yeah,
that's massively stinky, isn't it? Seabird puke.
It can be.
Now, Steph,
Fortunately, with birds that don't puke very much.
unless they're feeding.
Yeah.
Now, Steph, tell us what's taken you to Georgia.
So part of what I was looking at during my PhD research was how those marine threats might be affecting the recovery of seabirds to our islands and Aotearoa. And I've always been quite fascinated with plastic pollution in the sense that I hate it passionately and I want to get rid of it as much as I possibly can, and I'll do anything I can to do that. So I sort of have taken my research on seabirds, which I love as well, to shift away from the biological side of things and try and actually focus on making a bit of a difference in reducing plastic pollution. And so, yeah, I'm working on getting a better understanding about how much impact do different types of interventions have on reducing plastic leakage into the ocean.
So what could somebody do to support you in your efforts?
Buy me a cup of coffee.
Okay, that's so. Actually, that doesn't sound so ridiculous. Do you have like a Patreon campaign or something going on to support you in your practical efforts?
No, but I should really actually think about setting something up like that. Yeah, I think if anyone wants to support the work that I'm trying to do, it's take action in your personal lives to choose less plastic, to speak out about it, to lead by example, to go and pick plastic up off the beach.
I'm going to make an assumption that supermarkets and grocery stores and whatnot in New Zealand are quite similar to how they are in Australia. You haven't been in the States for too long, but you're now based there in Georgia. What's the packaging situation like for things like fresh food and other consumables in Georgia compared to Auckland?
There's a lot of similarities and there's some differences. There is quite a large takeout kind of culture here, which tends to be packaged in polystyrene. There's a lot of straws, a lot of the cups that you get when you go to cafes or eateries are plastic based, and so it is harder to avoid those items. You have to be really diligent about it. In terms of the supermarket, I think food packaging the world over is excessive on most things. You can find good markets here that have no plastic on them, but it is increasingly harder to find plastic-free packaging or plastic-free items, even in sort of healthy organic shops and all that sort of thing. So, yeah, it feels like in some ways we're taking 2 steps forward and then 3 steps back in terms of plastic pollution in both countries.
You mentioned earlier you're fairly positive about the outcome for seabirds, but are you seeing many corporate players actually reducing the unnecessary packaging that they're putting out there?
Not specifically. I think there's a lot. I'm optimistic because I think there's a lot of action happening at the international level, and although people are sort of not necessarily doing anything right now, there's a lot more recognition of the issue, and it's a slow process. Politics is always a slow process, as is any type of large-scale change where money is involved. So it's about convincing or consumers convincing those large organisations to take a stand. But in Aotearoa, the supermarket chains, again, they like in Australia, they did a voluntary plastic bag reduction statement saying that by the end of the year they would phase out single-use plastic bags. Unfortunately, they've replaced them with these very much heavier, thicker plastic bags, which have proven to be much more damaging in the environment than those single-use plastic bags. So it's a little bit counterintuitive in that sense. But I think that the motivation is there, and I think there will be some fits and starts and some obstacles in the way. But I have to have optimism because if I don't, then it would be very difficult for me to get out of bed every day.
Yeah, I can understand that. Otherwise, the weight of depression about the environmental catastrophes that are facing us just is too much to bear. Now, tell me something that I think people notice when they are in a new environment. What are the birds that you see day to day around you in Georgia compared to what you would have seen day to day in Auckland?
I see a lot of turkey vultures and crows, lots of cardinals, and there's lots of calls that I'm not familiar with. And so I do. It's lots of little birds that I notice around. There's quite a lot more diversity of birds here because they have evolved in the presence of predatory animals. So they've kind of figured out ways to deal with it and get around it. Whereas in Aotearoa, it can be very quiet in the city. You know, you'll hear tuis, which is amazing, and maybe some wax eyes and things like that. But the diversity in New Zealand for native species particularly is quite low, especially in urban areas. Lots of minors and invasive species, thrush. But and here there is definitely more of an abundance of bird life. But again, those species that are super common.
Do you notice the sparrows, and is the European starling a fixture there?
Yeah, there are starlings around, but I haven't. But actually, now that you pointed out, there's not a lot of sparrows around.
You know, I've got a little story about the sparrow. When I was a kid, I had this mindset that all these introduced birds were terrible and awful, and I wish they'd all go away. And here in Melbourne, we have the house sparrow as being the common little brown bird that everyone sees. But on my first trip into the Philippines, I went to a really remote province in Mindanao, and the most common bird there was the tree sparrow, followed by the house sparrow. And seeing them in a new setting and behaving quite differently because of the habitat they were in, I actually started to like the tree sparrow.
Yeah, I like the sparrow, and I have had similar experiences as you have, and going to a new environment and seeing a bird that's an invasive in New Zealand but is native to somewhere else. And yeah, I think you do have a bit more of an appreciation, but I also have more of an appreciation, I think, because of my understanding about novel ecosystems, and I hate using that term, but the idea that, you know, humanity is a part of this world. We're part of the ecosystem, and what we do is part of that process. And we may not like it all of the time, but we are still part of it. And I there's a danger in when we separate ourselves from the environment that will end up leading us down a very dark road. And so understanding that we are here and we can work within the bounds of the the natural world is really important. And in that, it gives you a bit more appreciation about some of those species that we might think of as being pests or not so appreciative of them. And turkey vultures are one of those. They're a really interesting species.
What do you like about them?
I don't know. I mean, they're just kind of a little bit. They sort of seem like out of a movie to me, like a dark, the villain in a movie. But they're kind of quite ungainly and wobbly when they fly.
So they're a bit funny and a bit evil.
Yeah, a bit funny and a bit evil, I suppose.
All right.
A bit like giant petrels, but not quite as cool, probably. Seabirds will always win the day for me.
How do they compare size-wise to the giant petrel?
Yeah, probably about the same size. I'm not sure of the weight differences, but giant petrels are about 2 meters in wingspan, and I wouldn't be surprised if the turkey vulture was close to that.
Can the turkey vulture pick up a turkey, do you think?
Oh, that would be amazing to see, wouldn't it?
I'm just trying to picture it. I'm thinking it's got to be a big bird.
Yeah, not quite as big as the house eagle, I don't think. But
now, have you seen anything that's really blown your mind so far in America, in the avian world?
No, I've been firmly lodged in an office for the last week and a half as I just started my postdoc. So yeah, doing lots of administration. So no birds, unfortunately, or very few. Anything exciting.
So in the next year or so, what's going to be filling your time?
I am going to be working with some amazing people on plastic pollution and trying to fill some information for international policy so that we can inform international policy so countries can make really informed decisions and good decisions about how they tackle plastic pollution and how they what sort of interventions they put into place. So we're looking at which ones are the best ones given different situations and socioeconomic conditions and infrastructure and things like that. And that will feed into the United Nations Environment Programme and other international sort of legislation around plastic.
So how can people follow your progress with that work?
You can follow me on Twitter at Petrel Station, Petrel Station, S-T-A-T-I-O-N.
Now, that is the best Twitter handle in the world, without saying.
I have to give credit to my sister for helping me with that one.
Well, she should be writing TV dramas and comedies because Petrel Station is just sensational.
Well, she's an online content producer for the environmental movement, so she does a lot of good words for the environment too, which is really cool.
Well, good work. 2 thumbs up. 3 cheers.
Yeah, and you can also follow our group. We've got a Twitter handle as well, which is Plastic PE Group.
Okay, well, I'll obviously link to those two with your permission in the show notes, Steph.
Absolutely.
I know we talked about the giant petrel and the royal albatross, but do you have a favourite bird?
Oh, do I have a favourite bird? I mean, yeah, I'm going to go with the New Zealand storm petrel. I just having held they're tiny little wee things, and the fact that they've managed to come back from extinction, I guess you'd say, just proves the resilience of nature and seabirds and how, we need to appreciate and respect them and try not to destroy them.
Now, you mentioned you're not a tweeter or twitcher. Beg your pardon.
Twitcher.
I know you're a tweeter because I've seen your tweets.
Prolific
that was
tweet.
a rookie error, wasn't it? Do you have a favourite bird book?
Seabirds of New Zealand.
Why would that be?
It's my Bible, I guess. If you're going to use that sort of term. Yeah, I have. Yeah, I don't know, any bird books, I guess.
Any bird book.
Well, I'm a big fan of reference books, so a non-fiction and. Yeah, I'm a nerd.
Any plans to write one?
A book?
Yeah,
I just wrote a thesis. I think that's pretty close to it being a book.
But I can't find that on the bookshelves. Where's the No plans to update Seabirds of New Zealand?
No, I'm not a taxonomist. I'm definitely more of an ecologist, getting my hands in the dirt, which is interesting coming to a very much a computer centric postdoc, but I think it's good to diversify.
Oh, actually, that's given me the opportunity to ask you one more question, Steph. What do you actually do as a research fellow? Like you said, you're knee deep in computers. How has it changed from what you were doing as a researcher now? How do you spend your days?
There's a lot of similarities to what I was doing. I spend a lot of time reading and I spend a lot of time writing and also watching videos on how to carry out statistical to make code and things like that, because I'm very much not a quantitative ecologist. So I
YouTube videos.
Yeah, on like how to write code, or I spend my time Frankensteining pieces of code together from all over the place. So I guess the biggest difference is that I don't have any field work in my postdoc, and that's for me that's quite. It's probably the biggest challenge. I really love being out working with birds and being in some of the most incredibly beautiful places I've ever been to. I've been in Aotearoa's New Islands, and so that's really difficult. But it just kind of forces me to make sure I go out and have time in nature when I'm not working.
Well, I hope you do. I hope you become very familiar with those birds of the southeast United States and get out on some pelagic trips off the coast there. Have you looked into that yet?
Not quite yet, but it's definitely in the plan. I'm going to be up towards the northeast, so I definitely want to do some pelagics out there. And I haven't seen a puffin in the wild yet, so I'm very excited to see a puffin.
Don't we all love puffins?
They're just so cool, aren't they?
David Attenborough has just been the champion of the puffin. Some of the takeoffs and landings of puffins in his series have been. How can you forget them? The dumpiest tumble turns. They're like seeing the countries that never win medals in gymnastics at the Olympics. Yeah.
I do. That's one of my favourite things, the dichotomy between that elegance of a flying seabird and their landings, which are never very elegant.
No, I think everyone loves a puffin. Anyone who's ever seen a puffin, I think, loves a puffin.
Yeah.
Well, Steph, thanks so much for being so generous with your time. It's been a delight learning more about you and your work, and I wish you all the best in your attempts to reduce the impacts of plastic on the seabirds of the world.
Thank you very much for having me on. It's been a pleasure. I always love talking about seabirds and plastic. My love and my greatest loves and my greatest hates all in the same.
Well, you never know as we go on with this series of episodes. I might find another reason to call upon your great expertise.
Anytime, Grant.
Thanks very much, Steph, and enjoy the. It's a balmy Georgia evening, I imagine.
It's a hot, sticky, sweaty Georgia evening.
Can you see any of that hanging down lichen out of or is it moss out of a conifer from your window?
No, no. Unfortunately, I don't have any of that. The old man's beard, they think
old
they
man's
call it.
Beard. Oh, and have you got how y'all doing? Have you got that down yet?
Oh yeah, y'all's always been in my vocabulary.
Fantastic. Well, thanks again, Steph. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks very much, Grant.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
I hope you enjoyed meeting Stephanie Borrelle, Dr. Stephanie Borrelle, as much as I did. Next week, we'll meet Amanda Lilliman, who's working on the Curlew project for the Far Eastern Curlew at Darwin Harbour at the top end of Australia. If you've got something to say, you want to give us your feedback on the bird emergency, go to thebirdemergency.com and leave a comment, or hit me up on Twitter @thebirdemergency. This is Grant Williams. I hope you'll join me next week.